Hello and welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. And I just realized that every time we start this, I don't know if I say RIVE first and then what it is or vice versa. But either way, this is RIVE. Welcome. And so I'm going to pass things off to Catherine because this was your turn to come up with our plan for the day.
Yeah. And in usual fashion, I didn't actually plan anything other than actually having a guest that I'm really excited about. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Jacque Pelzer to the show. So she has been at Virginia, Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine. I'll let her tell her story for, I guess, 14 or 15 years now, but she's my right-hand woman there, and she is our assistant dean for student affairs and admissions. And most of her job is actually admissions, and she'll tell you that, or sorry, is student affairs, and she'll tell you that. But what I'd kind of like to talk with her about today, particularly in light of the new SCOTUS ruling, is the competency-based admissions process that she's implemented and done such a really, really nice job with. So we're glad to have you here, Jacque. And if you'd like to just say a little bit about yourself and tell us who you are.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I really appreciate that, Catherine. And just want to say too that I really enjoy working with Catherine. It's just been a lot of fun, and I think making education fun is really important to how motivated we are in our jobs, for sure. So as Catherine said, I've been at Virginia, Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine for 15 years, actually. I'm going on 15 years. And previous to that, I had a short stint as career advisor in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences on the campus of Virginia Tech. But prior to that, I was in private practice here in Southwest Virginia, and my main focus was actually on production animals, so cattle and small ruminant. That's what I did. I was a road warrior is what I called myself. So in the truck almost all day, every day. And really, this position kind of just fell into my lap. It wasn't anything that I had particularly planned for. And I think I've learned quite a bit over the 15 years. And having a growth mindset, I think, is really important because you learn from some mistakes that we make, right, along the way. So that's just a little bit about how I got into education.
Yeah, that's great. Do you all have any questions for her? Or do you want me to just dive in?
How did you find the job announcement? What did it sound like? Yeah. Were you looking for jobs? Did someone call you? Like, I need more details.
I'm like, how do you fall into the job?
You cannot get me from production animal vet to director of student affairs.
Agreed. Yeah, that was my question to you. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, so that's really awesome. So the great thing about veterinary medicine, I think it opens a lot of doors for us, right? And so when I was in private practice, I actually owned my own practice. My husband, who's also a veterinarian, was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, and I had a 10-month-old at home. And he was really, really sick. He had chemo, radiation, and was actually going through tenure at the time as well. And so he was just really sick, and I just could not balance my life. So I couldn't work, the 90 hours a week that I was working, and try and take care of a little baby and take care of him as well. So I decided to take some time. I started part-time, and my clients didn't want me. They just didn't like me working part-time. So I completely sold my practice and stayed at home for about 6 months until Kevin, my husband, was in a little bit of a better place. And someone from the College of Agriculture reached out to me. They needed a career advisor specific to their pre-veterinary students. And I really loved working with students, and started that the world of education opened to me. I mean, I knew nothing about the method behind the madness of teaching veterinary students, right? And I did that job probably for a year when the director of admission reached out to me. I had been working with him some over that year, and he reached out to me and thought that I would be a great fit for that position. And it just so happened that the college was also hiring an associate dean at the same time. And she interviewed me and wanted me on her team. So that's kind of how I fell into that job with Jenny Hodgson at the time, You
got pulled into the job is what happened.
Yeah, we did. And so, and I don't know if anybody if there was another candidate. I really don't know. I mean, they never told me. But yeah, it's been a wild ride for sure.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that story, so that was really good to know.
Yeah.
Well, Yeah, I love
Welcome
hearing.
to the winding road of veterinary medicine.
I know. You just never know. Sometimes you get what you ask for.
Yeah. You don't, but that's
So my
okay.
question, how many times in that 15 years has your job title changed?
Just once, Bobby, and that's
Oh,
been
really?
most recently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I
okay.
started off as director, of admissions, and then thanks to Catherine, I think I actually was performing at an assistant dean level for probably 10 years.
Yeah.
But because of the university system, they didn't recognize assistant deans at the time. But thanks to Catherine, she helped get a title change for me, which actually for me nationally gives me a lot more credibility because my peers are assistant or associate deans at other veterinary schools. Yeah.
Gotcha. Oh, I see. I thought that was like going to be way more commonplace, that you were just like every few years. And because I feel like your job has likely evolved though, right? But
my job has definitely,
Gotcha. Okay. It's just the job title took 15 years to catch up.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It took some time to catch up, for sure.
I imagine some people listening can relate to that too.
Yeah.
What other questions do you all have before I dive in?
No, I think it's your turn. Go. Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we get into the, education stuff and specifically the competency-based admissions process, I am actually really fascinated by your prior life. So if you are open to sharing what you did before you became a veterinarian, I think it's important for people to understand that veterinary medicine isn't always a straight trajectory. So if you're willing to share, I'd love for you to share that.
Yeah, sure. And I actually like sharing my story with pre-veterinary students because not all of us have that easy ride to veterinary medicine. And so when I graduated actually from high school when I was 16, so really young, and I had a scholarship to go to a school actually close to Virginia Tech. It's called Ferrum College. And at the time, and this is somewhat relevant to me, quite honestly, the male to female ratio was 7-1. And it was a small school. And I had never really, being 16 and very naive and shy, had never been around boys or alcohol. And where I went to school was actually moonshine capital of the world. So it was here and and so we had moonshiner kids that I went to school with. So at the end of the semester, I actually left with a 0 GPA. And I'm actually kind of quite proud of that. Because how many people do you know that has 0 GPA, right?
I think you're probably the first that I know of, as far as I know.
Right. And so my mom said, I think it's time for you to come home. You're just not mature enough to be away. And she was right.
Yeah.
But I decided I moved to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, which is on the Atlantic Ocean. And I opened a surf shop and I surfed professionally for about 5 years. And I really grew a lot in that time. But it was a wonderful experience, and especially owning my own business was fantastic. And I really learned a lot about customer service and just, working with people. And I did some lifeguarding as well. And I love that life, but I had always wanted to be a veterinarian. And I think having my own business gave me the confidence that I needed and the maturity level that I needed to go back to school. So I went back to Richmond, Virginia, where I grew up, and I attended Virginia Commonwealth University. I got a bachelor's in biology and actually graduated top of my class. So bye-bye 0 GPA. And got a master's in pharmacology while I was there, and then applied here and got in. And I graduated in 1997 from Virginia, Maryland. So that's kind of my journey to veterinary medicine. But I think, again, I'm really invested in growth mindset. And I think that I learned so much from all of those bumps in my road to veterinary medicine.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know that you'd ever told me you had a 0 GPA.
Oh, yeah. I actually went to take an exam. It was like a dream. I went to class. I decided, okay, I'm going to go to class. And there was an exam.
It was one of those, wait, I didn't know there was an exam today. Yep.
I was like,
I
oh,
hope you also know the next time I see you, I'm going to want to see some photos of the surf day.
Yeah. I actually made it to the cover of Surfer magazine. Yeah.
What?
I mean, it was amazing.
I know.
Yeah, I was East Coast champion for 5 years in a row. But Bobby, I was one of the few females that were surfing at the time. So there you go.
Doesn't
Don't
matter.
minimize it. Don't
Yeah,
minimize
absolutely. That's awesome. Good for you.
Yeah.
So
That's
cool.
pretty cool. Well, and that
And now
might
I look
be-
back and I'm like, why did I leave that life?
right.
I could be wearing
my mind.
puka shells and,
It's funny because when you first said that, I'm like, wow, that's really surprising. And then I thought about it. I'm like, you know what? It's not actually. I love it. That's awesome.
Well, Eric has a master's degree in sport pedagogy, so you guys might have a lot to talk about.
Wow. There you go. Awesome.
These are the things you find out. This is why it's so interesting to talk to people, because everybody has such an interesting story. And I ask people this question. They're like, well, my life's really generally boring. And then they tell me their life. And I'm like, no, that's not boring. Like, it might be boring to you because it's your life, but it's not boring to me. So, and I agree. I mean, I think it's really important for students to understand that there's not just this one straight, narrow path, and that you have to be this perfect student with all of the right boxes checked, and you have to do this, whatever, and just to get into that school. And it's nice to see that, everybody has a story and everybody has a skeleton in their closet or two. So
Yes, we do.
yeah. So I think, did you have a comment, Bobby, or a question?
Nope.
I think, we have this opportunity. It's Reflections in Veterinary Education, and you've been in veterinary education for a long time. You've written a book with Jenny Hodgson that's coming out with its second edition. So Virginia, Maryland has two textbooks that are out for veterinary education. So that's pretty cool.
And actually, Eric is one of our contributors. So
yeah, he contributed to my textbook too. And Bobby contributed to my textbook. So it's kind of,
Yep.
yeah, Bobby did too. Yeah.
little writing family here. So, but I think my big question is, one of the things that really struck me when I first started working with you, and that continues to really be, I think, great about working with you, is that you're really passionate about the admissions process and trying to improve the admissions process in a way that is fair and equitable, but also recognizes the individual strengths and weaknesses of students. And you have I know you haven't had a chance to publish some of this information, but you have so much data and so much sort of information that I think people could learn from in veterinary education. And so I don't know where you want to start with that, but I would love to hear sort of how you got interested in it, the admissions. I know it was part of your job, but how did you really get passionate about it, interested in it? And then just tell us a little bit about the process and how you ended up sort of landing on the process that you landed on.
Yeah, and Catherine, I've talked a little bit about that first year. And I think for me, I reflect a lot just on my personal veterinary education, but I clearly remember my interview for veterinary school, and I imagine you all do as well. And I remember at the time that it struck me that we all had very different experiences in that interview process. And when I went through, we had what they called a hot team and a cold team, and the hot team knew everything about you. They had the application in front of you, and the cold team only knew your name. And each interview was 15 minutes long. The questions that they asked me during that process were very different from questions that they asked my classmates or other candidates. And they asked questions. They asked me, again, I just remember they asked me what the rabies laws were in Virginia. And yeah. And, and then kind of gave me these, scenarios of, what if a cat's unvaccinated and it's indoors? It was just strange to me, and of course I was very successful. I think part of that is because I am an extrovert, and, I'm not afraid to say what's on my mind, I guess. But that stayed with me. And so when I came into this position and I saw what was currently being done, I was a little appalled, quite honestly, if I can say that.
Yeah.
Jackie, sorry to interrupt, but what year did you start your position?
2009.
Okay, just for context. So okay.
Yeah. And so it really was people, two people meeting in a room. I'm going to air the dirt a little bit, two people meeting in a room and selecting people that were a lot like them, right? Yeah. And then the interviews, I sat in that first year on the interviews, they really were still selecting people that, again, that looked like them, you know, that they somewhat identified, and it was very subjective, I would say, very subjective. And the questions, again, were very different. So I started in 2010, I went to my first AMY meeting. And for those that aren't familiar with AMY, it's an international medical educator group that meet yearly in Europe somewhere. It's typically in the UK. It has been a few other places, but that's where I got super excited. To use a surfer term, I was stoked about admissions. And I was just fascinated with what medical education was doing in student selection, and the tools that they were using to select students made perfect sense to me. And I kind of found my place and started just really investigating it. And the first tool that I put into place was changing our interview process to multiple mini interviews from this panel discussion, because they had been using multiple mini interviews in medical education at that time for, I don't know, 12 to 15 years, something like that. So there was lots of data out there to support it. And it was rough. I tell you, people thought I was crazy. They thought I was, again, I'm blonde, and they're thinking, what does this little blonde girl know about MMIs? I mean, I actually had somebody say that to me, And Bobby, I don't know if you remember Mike Lee, who I adore. He's an internal medicine. He taught me when I went through school, but he looked at me and he said, what is this, a circus? And I said, well, do I look like a clown to you? So there was a lot of pushback. Just a lot of pushback from trying to change, just overhaul the entire admissions process. So that's kind of where I got super excited about admissions, was learning from medical education.
Yeah, it's funny. It strikes me that because I think we all have experienced the resistance to change, but I think what I've observed over the years is that when people are resistant to change, but they can't put their finger on what it is they're upset about, they deflect, right? And so it's about you now. It's not that, like, who's this person coming in and why does your hair color matter? But whatever, like, they have to find something to blame because they're just uncomfortable. And so there is, I find often this like redirection or this, this deflection to something that is irrelevant because they don't know how to handle their like fear and frustration from change. But it's it's hard to deal with. Like, I mean, good for you for just like being like, yep, this is, yes, whatever, this is what we're doing. And I love that.
Yeah. And I don't know what it was like for you all when you first started, but I was so naive, right? Just so naive about education. And I truly believe that student selection is a part of veterinary education. It doesn't just happen. Student selection needs to align with our curriculum so that the students that we choose are successful in our program, right? But I think most people, maybe not so much anymore, but at the time, certainly admissions was just something that happened. It wasn't really relevant to the success of the program. I guess that's how I felt. I perceived that.
It's just people's lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like we're making decisions that are going to affect anyone's life. It's like you're either going to be a vet or you're not going to be a vet, and we get to decide that. And that's terrifying if you really think about it, because you literally have people's lives in your hands when you're talking about admissions. So yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of the things that Virginia and Maryland does in their interview process, and Jackie, obviously correct me if I get this completely wrong, but I think I've talked to you enough that I understand. So there's a quantitative portion, which is the initial sort of screening portion, because we get around, and I don't know what Auburn gets, but I know we get around 16 to 1800 applications a year, give or take 100 or 2 applications. And we have about 125 seats, right? And so that's less than a 10% acceptance rate. And so there's this initial quantitative sort of survey of the applications, and they have to meet a minimum. There's a rubric, right? And they get certain numbers of points depending on what their GPA is and what their hours are and their letters of recommendation, all that kind of thing. And then what I find really interesting about our system is that once you've made that cut to be invited for an interview, that all goes away. And what really determines if you get accepted to our program is the interview process. And that interview process, I think if you want to talk about that a little bit more would be great. But my understanding is that it's 16 different raters that look at these videos now. And so it's not it's no longer a truly I mean, it's somewhat subjective, right? But there's 16 different people. And if you have 14 of the 16 people who are saying, this is a great person, let's accept them. It's
one person isn't likely to derail somebody.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about that a little bit more, Jackie?
Sure. And just to provide just a little bit of history, when we first implemented the multiple many interview, we did them in person. And we developed, and the premise of multiple many interviews is that it provides a fair and transparent process to all candidates, right? And you're absolutely right. We set all the scores to 0 at the time of interview because the committee feels that we've done a decent job of selecting students that would be academically successful in the program. We really just want to learn a little bit more about them now with these interviews, right? And so when we did them in person, there was one rater in the room. I spent a lot of time writing these scripts that the rater was supposed to adhere to. They weren't supposed to stray from that script, but as humans do, they would stray from the script, right? But our reliability actually was decent with the in-person. We were actually pretty happy with the reliability. And then COVID hit, and we really needed to be a little more innovative about continuing with the interview process in the midst of a pandemic. And so we did find an online virtual platform that we went to do these interviews. But the beauty about doing these asynchronous multiple many interviews is that we have 2 independent raters per scenario, and the raters don't know each other. They don't talk to one another. They simply submit a score, write some observations about the candidate. So as Catherine said, there's 16 independent raters. Our reliability went off the charts. I mean, it was really great in regards to psychometrics, right? And what we were doing to try to create this fair and transparent process. As you know, the multiple many interviews are designed to assess very specific attributes. So there's 8 attributes that we're assessing, 1 attribute per scenario. And then there's an overall communication score, because it's very difficult to tease out the communication from these other attributes, right? But it's just been fascinating for me, fascinating with these videos. And I tell you, having the videos is legally defensible, let's say, at times. How about that?
Yeah. It's been a great process. And then I think the last piece, just before we get to a point where maybe we're doing more question and answer type stuff, is can you talk about the distance traveled metric that you use and why, especially in light of the SCOTUS decision, why that's such an important part of our application process?
Yeah, so one thing that the committee is very committed to is trying to support candidates that were honestly maybe like me, that had some bumps in the road, that haven't had access to all the important things on this journey to veterinary medicine. So for example, veterinary experiences, maybe being able to go to a 4-year institution, maybe having to work full-time while they're trying to take classes. So we actually call that distance traveled. And that's one of the tools that we use that's actually embedded in our holistic admissions process. So that initial review prior to interview. And we actually used it as an advocacy piece. So as Catherine pointed out, we do this quantitative ranking that includes academics and non-academics as well. But we want to dig deeper into each applicant's story. And so we are committed to reading every application, and the stories that we read are great. Now, sometimes when we use that distance traveled rubric and we assign points to a candidate, those points might be enough to push them over the cutoff for an interview. But we also have an advocacy piece that our committee feels pretty passionate about. And they have the ability to advocate for candidates that they reviewed their applications that did not make the cutoff for interview. They have the opportunity to advocate to the rest of the committee members to see if we'll agree to giving those candidates an interview. Typically, there's about 15 of those candidates every year out of the 1,800 that we have. It's about 15 that we decide. And prior to the SCOTUS affirmative action decision, race was one of the factors that we had in our distance travel rubric, but it was in the context of, did your ethnicity, culture, race ever create a barrier for you on this journey. That's really the context or the framework that we used, race, ethnicity, culture. Of course now, and we can talk about it, that's been taken off the table. So,
well, that's interesting because like in the way you described it, maybe it hasn't been taken off the table, right? Like, because the decision is you cannot have race, you get points assigned based on your race. But if you're talking about how this impacted your journey, you are, I think, still allowed, at least some of the things that I've read in like some, lawyers' interpretations of this decision, that like affirmative action is just saying that based on race alone, you can't, favor or disfavor any candidate. But if that directly led to some other, experiences or attributes that you want to, give credit for, I think you still can. So it's interesting, like the way it's set up, you might actually, might be fine and not have to change anything. Maybe some wording just to clarify that for folks, but it's interesting.
Yeah, so it all depends on how each state's attorney general interprets the law. So for us, it needs to come off of the rubric. But that's not to say that, because we have a resiliency essay that we ask our applicants to respond to, and that's where we do capture a lot of that information. So we'll be able to, based on that resiliency essay, to again advocate if we want. Yeah. So there are ways, I believe, that we will still be able to maintain the diversity of our student community without specifically having race anywhere printed on any material. We do have to hide all the demographics and actually blind our admissions committee members to race. And we did have to take all mention of race off of the website as well. But I personally, I think that because of the tools, and we'll talk about competency-based admissions here in a minute, I think because of the tools that we're using, we aren't going to experience so much of a change in the diversity of our student community based on those tools we're using.
Well, because it's more than like, it's already fairly holistic and looking at all sorts of things. And I actually just really love the phrase like distance traveled, and just kind of what that implies. And it's because it's not just a physical distance, obviously, right? Like that's, maybe that factors in for some, but for the most part, it's just life, distance in life traveled. And so that will, in and of itself provide a means for a type of diversity, right, of the student, which is great.
Yeah, and it's not restricted to race or ethnicity. That can be, you could be LGBTQ, or it could be because you're sort of a minority religion, or because you come from a first generation person in your life. There's all these different things that are covered by that. So it's really nice. But I also, interestingly, in all of the conversations that I make Jackie have with me, you have mentioned several times that oftentimes of those 10 or 15 or those 15 folks who are advocated for every year, actually the majority of them are not racially or ethnically.
That's exactly right. They're usually first gen. Maybe they've been socioeconomically challenged. So that's the majority of those that we've advocated for, which has been interesting.
Yeah. Eric, you've been awfully quiet. Do you have questions?
I don't know, it might derail us a little bit, but I guess my experience with the interview process is, realistically, like you said, everyone that's interviewing is basically qualified. So my experience is that you're basically trying to find those 5% that have no idea what the heck they're doing and no idea what they're getting into. And it seems like a massive effort, an amount of work, not just your process, but everyone's process, to identify those 5%. So I guess I have two questions. One, does that align with your impression? Like, do you think that the vast majority are basically fine and we're just like finding the handful of outliers with the interview process? And two, like, do you think that energy is worth it?
So Eric, I do think the energy is worth it. And honestly, I think what you're asking is going to be very difficult to tease out, because I can tell you that when we started doing the multiple mini interviews, the faculty came to me and said, the students we're teaching now are very different. We love teaching these students. They seem to be very engaged in their education. So that's a very difficult perception to measure, I guess, right? But I I do believe we're taking different types of students here at Virginia, Maryland, and there, the average GPA hasn't changed. You're right. The average GPA of those students that are admitted hasn't changed, but I do think that we are taking students that have these attributes at some foundational level. And these were things that we weren't measuring before. And we can talk about validity. I don't know if they're valid or not, right? We can talk about that. But when I watch these videos, in fact, I told Catherine this morning, I did some interview feedback sessions this morning. When I watch these videos, it really is weeding out some individuals that just aren't ready. I mean, they just aren't ready, or they just don't possess those attributes at a level that we expect in a professional program. Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think also our professional problems have decreased. We're starting to see, I think, of it a little bit more, just because maybe you probably have already done a podcast about this, but maybe some generational differences maybe that we're seeing. And, our students now are more consumers than they were when I went through. And so I think they have a different expectation of their education. But I do think it's important to interview for our program. It might not be for everybody.
Can I ask a kind of a follow-up tangent to that? How many of that 16 to 1800, how many get interviewed, and then how many are ultimately accepted? Because obviously some of them that interview end up, going other schools and whatnot, but like what are roughly the numbers?
Yeah. So we have 4 pools, right? So we have West Virginia, which we have contract seats. We have Virginia, we have Maryland, and we have out of state. A total number of about 380 candidates interview. The majority of those are going to be your at-large students.
Okay.
And we accept 125 out of those 380. But our placement rate is really good. I mean, we just with first round offers, we have a really good acceptance yield with our candidates. So that's something to be said. We do a lot of recruitment on the front end. That probably helps with that. But yeah, and we get a mixed review on these interviews from our candidates, right? Some of them love it. I think the ones that love it are the ones that get in. The ones that hate it don't get in.
Well, that's interesting. What about to kind of follow along on the track? Like, what about those candidates who just don't interview well for whatever reason, right? Like they get really nervous, they're anxious, they haven't had really good coaching, they haven't had experience with this. Do you feel, after this process, after so many years, do you feel, because by the time they get to the interview part, everything's kind of riding on the interview. Mm-hmm. And so do you think there are some students that maybe slip through the cracks because of that?
Probably. The one thing, though, that I'm committed to is I think that everyone deserves some remediation or some feedback at least, right? And so I do commit to our candidates that interview and are unsuccessful that I will provide them feedback sessions. So this summer, I've done 180 of those so far. They're 30 minutes in length. I go through each of their responses to the scenarios. I have their videos, I have their scores, I have the rater feedback for them. And the ones that reach out are very appreciative. And I've done the data too on this, is that 90% of those that reach out to me will get in after the second interview.
Boom. That's amazing, right?
And the 10% who don't get in clearly shouldn't be in, right? Like, because if you get back and you're told these are the things that were a concern for you, and these are ways that you can approach that, and then you decide that you're not going to take that feedback, that's not the kind of person we want in our program anyway. And there are people who do slip through the cracks to get into the program. I think there's no perfect system, right? So there are people who can interview really well and are still not the kinds of people that you want in the profession, but they're smart and that kind of thing. And I mean, there's probably 1,500 people who don't get interviews, or I guess 1,200 people that don't get interviews that are potentially just as capable.
Oh, for sure.
academically, but they just don't have the life experience or the maturity or whatever. So.
Yeah. At 1800, you got to cut it off somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, you can't interview all of them, right?
No, but that's amazing, Jackie, that you spend that time and offer that to those folks. And that, but it's really great to be able to say that, right? If they just get a little coaching, because some of the other ones may have gotten coaching from someone else, but you're basically offering to level the playing field for those candidates. And the cost is a year, right? Like they have to try again next year, but it sounds like in general, that makes a huge difference. So if the only deficit they have is interview skills, you're providing them, like you said, that remediation, and that's amazing. Because I feel confident that few, if any, other schools have a system like that where they take that individualized time. Like that's incredible.
And I do hear that quite a bit. I hear that the students really don't know what the expectations are, and the candidates don't. And it's just like an assessment. They need to know what those expectations are. And so I do information sessions before they actually record their responses. They're provided all of those attributes ahead of time. I don't provide the rubrics to them because I know they'll get out there somewhere. But I try to provide them as much information as possible before they actually sit the interview.
And I think, Eric, just to your point, and this is just my own personal experience in the few times that I participated in interviews of prospective students at a different institution, it is a lot of work to find that 5%. And some of those 5% still slip in, I think, because they figure out the system and they can play the game. But when you're able to keep those out, it's worth it, right? So, and I'll give you an anecdote. So when I was interviewing at my previous institution, I was helping out with interviews, and I've been telling sort of Jackie horror stories about people, like, the kid that walked in and he's like, came in and he sat down like this and he just kind of leaned back in his chair and was, and you're like, okay, no. But then, we had this one young woman who came in, and she was on paper, she was this just phenomenal applicant, right? She had a master's degree in food safety and hygiene, and she had done really well in her undergraduate degree. She's really committed and passionate. She seemed to really understand veterinary medicine. And so one of the questions, our question system wasn't great, but one of the questions we asked her was something, I can't even remember. It was something about, tell us a time when you had some kind of altercation or some kind of negative thing, and how did you manage it? And she went off on this, and Jackie's laughing because she knows this story, but it was like, she was like, well, I will tell you what, I was at a tailgating party and there was this gentleman there who was obviously drunk, and I sat there and I watched him, and he barbecued these hot dogs, and then he ate one, but then he left the other hot dogs out in the sun for like an hour, and then he went back and he took a hot dog and he was getting ready to eat it. And I walked up to him and I grabbed that hot dog out of his hand and I said, no, sir. And I threw it in the trash. And I said, I just saved your life. You might have died from eating that hot dog. Do you understand what could happen for leaving that hot dog out? And she's sitting here telling us the story, and she's obviously like really happy with herself. And I'm like, no, I don't want this person in my program.
But
right?
So
like
passionate about food safety.
Well, but it was like, okay, so you're a bully. You don't know this person. And then, and it's like very unreasonable. That's not the kind of person that I want to call a colleague someday. So, yeah, it's a lot of work. And Jackie
was telling the story like the hero of this story.
Yes, very much so. Right. And so Jackie's the hardest working person in my office by far, 100%. And I appreciate that. But yeah, so for me, just, I think back to that story when you asked that kind of question, Eric, I'm like, yeah, and she probably got in somewhere, right? On paper, she was a stellar student. She got in somewhere.
So for me, that begs the question, Jackie, is there a veto system in your current interview process, right? Where someone can just say no?
Yeah, so we have a red flag system. And so we will discuss the red flags and we'll watch those videos to make a determination as to whether that individual is accepted or not. Yes.
So there's a way to you've basically flagged them. So the two people who are reviewing are like, ooh, this is really concerning. So even though the rest of it was really good, you can then go back to the committee and they can be like, yeah, the hot dog story is going to not cut it.
Yeah, right. So for example, one of the feedback sessions I did this morning, the candidate used foul language throughout his entire response to the scenario. But he didn't do that on the other scenarios, right? So that raised a red flag. Those two raters actually red flagged him the committee watched his videos and decided not to accept him based on the foul language that he used, which was very unprofessional.
Yeah. That's probably not the kind of individual you want to be training. So,
No.
Well, because like, okay, here's my swearing is the thing, right? There's actually some research that it correlates with intelligence, but knowing when is okay and when it's not, that's the problem. So it's not like, my personal opinion is that swearing in and of itself doesn't have to mean anything. Like, their words, we assign meaning to them. But you're interviewing for like, now's not the time. And the fact that you didn't recognize that's the issue. It's not the swearing. Like,
yes, right.
But it's okay, what other judgment issues are we going to run into?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Of course, I've never sworn before. I just want to put that out there. That's never.
I don't even know what the word swear means. That I've never heard it before. I'm just assuming it's bad.
You were confused this whole time.
Yeah, I was very confused. So yeah, do you all have other questions before I ask her to talk about sort of the competency-based?
Oh no, that's where I thought we'd go next. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Tell us about competency-based admissions.
So I'm just really excited. And again, looking at medical education, thank you, medical education, for being so forward thinking. Because why reinvent the wheel, right? So holistic admissions is the ability to review that application that you get, that centralized application, and trying to balance academics with some non-academics, right? That's what holistic admission is. Where competency-based admission is actually trying to assess a student's entry-level competency. And again, at a very foundational level. And our committee came up with interpersonal, intrapersonal as our domains, scientific knowledge, and humanities and social science domains. So there's 4 domains, and under those domains, we have competencies as well. And we have, for the most part, the tools in place to assess all those competencies. Some of those competencies are assessed using the actual application. So for example, distance traveled is reflective of maybe some social skills, life choices, those types of things. So they're going to use the application for that. Letters of evaluation will help provide ethical and maybe moral choices that individuals have made. But I think what's really interesting that we've kind of modeled a little bit after Ohio State's prerequisites is that now our candidates get to select the science courses that they would like to use for prerequisites. And they have to take a minimum of 24 credit hours in science, and will take a maximum of 30 credit hours of science. And so really it's their overall grade that's reflecting a competency in scientific knowledge. We do still have some prerequisites. So biochemistry is a prerequisite, microbiology is a prerequisite, medical terminology is a prereq. The other thing too that we did, so this took years of work, right? So this took years of surveying our stakeholders, talking to faculty, talking to students before we actually implemented competency-based admission. But we also looked at the curriculum because the curriculum had changed in 2016. And we wanted to make sure that the students that we were selecting were successful. So what were those predictors on the admissions end, right? And I felt like we needed to change the prereqs because there's one class in our curriculum that our students really struggle in, and that's a class called dealing with threats. So that's anything that threatens the life of an animal. So that's where your micro is, your immuno, virology is in there, toxicology, parasitology, and they seem to be really struggling in bacteriology. That's what they seem to really be struggling in. So that's why we came up with microbiology as a prereq, because we think all of our students actually need that to be successful the first year. So competency-based admissions is going to put a lot of work on our committee probably for a year or two until we get used to just kind of the rhythm of what courses are fulfilling all these different competencies, what attributes might be fulfilling these competencies. But I'm really excited about it. I'm super excited about it. And it gives us one more tool in our toolbox Along with competency-based admissions, we're also developing a situational judgment test. And I feel very blessed that I'm working with Fiona Patterson. I mean, she's a rock star to me. She's in medical education. She's published a lot in student selection, and I just think the world of her. But I'm working with her group. They're called the Work Psychology Group. And we've designed a pilot program this year for situational judgment tests. And we're trying to figure out where we're going to use that in the overall process. But that will be one more tool in our toolbox for student selection.
So I think one of the things that I want to point out about this is that there are so many people who do admissions that just sort of do admissions, right? They're like, it's kind of like teaching. It's like, I'm going to do the process that I went through, but you have even less experience with admissions because you don't really know all the work that goes in behind the scenes. And when I ended up taking this job, I've been, here for a little bit over a year. And I'm always so impressed with the amount of evidence and research and the thoughtfulness that has been applied to the system that we use at Virginia, Maryland. And the vast majority of that is credited to Jackie and the passion that she has for this. And so I'm super proud that I work with you, and I'm super proud that you're.
Thank you, Kim.
Because I just think that you've done such a fabulous job of making sure that we get the best students that we can get. Again, there's no perfect process. We always have one or two, right? But I think we do a really, really good job. And all of that is because Jackie just does all this work and doesn't always get a lot of credit. So
well, I really appreciate that.
So
I think the thing that I'm most interested in, though, in regards to admission is actually what the outcomes are, right? So we all say, oh, we graduate these great veterinarians, but we don't know that, right? And I'm really fascinated with perhaps moving admissions to where we're working with the ebbs and flows of the profession itself, right? So, there is a need right now for food animal and equine veterinarians. If you look at the AVMA survey, graduating survey, it's alarming to me how many individuals are choosing not to work in food animal medicine and equine medicine, right? And so is there a way that we can legally defend this process to fill those quotas, right? So that I call that social responsibility.
Yeah, there's a societal.
And I think we do. Yeah, absolutely. We need to, as veterinary schools, be socially responsible. So what does that look like with the admissions process, and how you can't contractually bind a candidate, though, right? A candidate, because when I went through, if you said you were going to,
yeah,
right, absolutely. So it's like, how do you address rural communities, right? How do we get these students interested in going to rural communities? And so that's what I'm really fascinated with. I'm trying to figure out a way to move us in that direction. So that's like the next thing I want to work on.
Yeah.
I have a question. So another thing that I find really interesting, and I'm curious in all the work you've done and what your thoughts are. You made a comment earlier in the podcast, Jackie, about finding students that would be successful at our program. And one thing, like I always think about the match for internships and residencies. And when I'm advising students, I'm like, it's not about finding the best program or this, it's about finding where you are going to thrive. And so that's part of it, is finding the students that will match in the curriculum. But I also think about the class as a cohort, and how important that may be, right? Like if you have, a student who doesn't feel like they belong in this class, like what impact is that going to have on them as an individual as well as the group dynamic? And so, what are your thoughts on that over the years? And is there something you can do at the admissions level, or is that just like, luck of the draw? Or is there something you do, or is there something you thought about to try to create, this blending, right? You need that diversity, you need different thoughts, you need different backgrounds to have that work. But I go back to like playing sports. Like I've, the teams that I've been on that were most successful were not, I would think almost to a T, not made up of the individually most talented athletes, but there was something about that team that just really gelled and worked together. And there were obviously talented people, but that wasn't the it. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts to that mess of a question.
Sure. And I'll put kind of my teaching hat on too as well. So we do assess teamwork in the multiple minute interview. That's one thing we do assess. And we also assess cultural humility or cultural competency. So there's two questions around those attributes. The cultural humility question, the scenario really demonstrates that our college is committed to creating a diverse student community, and we want to learn more about what the candidate's going to do to contribute to that community and how they'll create inclusivity within that environment. So that's one question. That's actually been pretty telling. And then the teamwork one as well has been fascinating. But you're right, Bobby. I think I guess my belief at our particular college that I think we do a really great job of getting these students into the program. What we don't do such a great job at right now is providing the student support to underrepresented minority students, quite honestly. And so we need to do a better job of, yeah, we can talk all day during the recruitment. Oh, we're going to support you when you get here, but we really need to do that. We need to commit to that, right? Because I do believe that's lacking in our program. The one thing that I do, and thank goodness Catherine's going to take over these classes, is I teach all they're called Becoming a Veterinary Professional class. And so that's where we're talking about communication, clinical reasoning, the business management, all this hodgepodge stuff in the course. But one thing that I've done is I have a tool, actually Purdue University, not the vet school, but the engineering school created a tool, and it's called CatMe. And I use that tool to assess their teamwork. And that's been very telling because I have found some predictors in the interview process that's predicting their ability to work in healthcare teams when they get here. So I need to dig a little bit deeper into that. And then taking it even farther, I have done a lot of looking at what predicts performance in clinical years, specifically in the areas of communication, teamwork, and professionalism. And the interviews do predict that as well. So I think we have a tool. It's just how do we really make it more robust?
Yeah.
I'm really interested with the data that you mentioned and that Catherine mentioned is a lot of data driven. The one question that we have here that we've talked about recently is we want to look at the students that didn't succeed in our program and see, are there predictor variables that we might be able to identify? I mean, someone just needs to do the work and we haven't done it here. I'm curious if.
Yeah, we have done it, and it's interesting. Our attrition rate's really low, right? So we might lose one or two students a year. So that number is not real big, right? But it gives me the ability to really dig into their background. And really there wasn't a predictor. It has highlighted the fact that there might be some grade inflation at some programs that we're taking students from. And you don't want to make that public, right? I mean, so, but really there was nothing on the centralized application itself that helped us at all with what was going to predict that student from failing out. Sometimes it might be that they've got some personal problems at home, right? That's typically why our students will fail out. Very rarely is it because of aptitude or intellect, quite honestly. But there was nothing in the application. And in fact, when we implemented the new curriculum in 2016, no longer a new curriculum, sorry, the curriculum in 2016, we couldn't predict academically at all who was going to succeed in the class, and this class is based on the courses that they took in undergrad. There were zero predictors. Zero. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, I think that's, it's just highlights the fact that it's all a messy process, and we can only push it. We can only squeeze it into a box before it starts poking out in areas and not contained. That you just have to know that you're sometimes going to miss. I wanted to go back. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say on that, I mean, Jackie, you said the attrition rate is really low. So, it seems like overall doing a pretty good job, at least in the larger pool, or it's just, there's a lot of people who would do well. And so, it's just, finding the folks that you think will fit pretty well, because then, again, it's providing the supports, providing a good experience and a good learning environment, and that, they probably will succeed. And I think that's anecdotally certainly been my observation of those that struggle. It's usually from other things. And some of the literature, at least in medical school, is mixed. At least that's what I've read. Some of it's like, oh yeah, you can predict these things, and others like, yeah, no, that you can't. So it seems very, again, low attrition rates make it really hard to go back and figure that out.
Yeah, but that's back to Eric's point of why even interview them if we think they're all going to be academics. But I would argue that we really want our students to possess these attributes that we're assessing during the interview process, right? That's really why we're doing it. But Eric's absolutely right. I mean, if we could just take the top 120 students that apply.
Or like what I've thrown out there before, once they meet that first criteria, it's just a lottery.
Random.
Yeah, for sure.
I just go back to every now and then, I think, I've found people who are board certified specialists who are terrible to work with. And it's like, look, they got admitted to vet school, they got admitted to an internship, they got admitted to a residency, and then they got admitted to a faculty position. How did that happen? Right? There are so many cascading failures that must have happened that suggests to be like, I don't know, roll a dice.
I do think there's something to be said for that, but I also think that if we did roll the dice, then we're leaving it to chance. And so maybe it's just that we want to control it a little bit more, and we think we're controlling it and we're really not.
It does remind me of doing rope recovery in horses. It's like, it makes us feel like we're doing something. But I don't really think it's doing much.
But I think that's true no matter what you do. I mean, I'm thinking about the recent scandal at Stanford, right? With the Stanford president who has now he's basically resigned because he's not done some retractions on things in his lab that were clearly, not accurate. And I mean, he made it all the way to the presidency of Stanford University, and nobody, called him out or found him out. And he obviously, was able to get through. So we're going to have those people, I think, that do slip through the cracks. But I think for the most part, we do a pretty good job. And I think I wanted to go back to this idea of, we do get a pretty good diverse group of students. And a lot of times, unfortunately, our students that are sort of on the margins tend to be from those underserved communities, whether that's race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, whatever. And so I've been having some conversations with some people in nursing who've been sort of like career academics, and we were talking about this phenomenon. And this particular individual is very, very committed to increasing diversity across the healthcare professions. And so we were having this conversation, and she said, it's really interesting because she had a team of people that had done some investigation into sort of what you were talking about, Eric. Like, are there ways that we can predict, maybe not at admissions, but are there ways that we can predict whether students are or are not going to be successful once they get accepted to professional school? And it was like, I don't know why I never thought of it. I wish I had. It was this genius, like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. But for those of you who are in public health or understand public health, there's this concept of social determinants of health, right? So there's these things that are not necessarily academic or even necessarily economic, but they're like, how much social support do you have? What kind of friends do you have? What kind of family do you have? What kind of social networks do you have? And so they termed it social determinants of learning, sort of patterned after social determinants of health. And they did a study, and they discovered that 60 to 70% of what determines those students' success in those programs were the social determinants of learning, which tells me, again, right, all of these students that are selected are capable of getting through academically. They're intellectually capable. It doesn't matter where they came from. If they've gone through the classes, they've taken the test, they've done all those things, they're academically prepared. What they are not necessarily prepared for is not having the comfort and support of that network of people, right, that make a difference. Now, that could be one person, or that could be an entire community of people. And this is something that I struggle with, because people come to me sometimes in there, especially, for example, because it's easy, right? So a person of color, let's say a young Black woman is struggling. And I have, unfortunately, oftentimes white people come to me and say, well, see, this is why we shouldn't accept students from historically Black colleges and universities, because they don't have the same standards. They're not getting the same preparation. They're just not as well prepared academically. And I have to look at them and say, so first of all, that is patently false, right? We have the research to demonstrate that any student that's accepted to this program is academically capable of getting through the program. What they don't have is a place to go and worship, to get their hair done, to eat the kind of foods they want to eat, the kind of communities that they're used to having. That's what they don't have. And there are a few people who get that, and there are a few people who don't get that. But I think my point is that there's now published literature out there based on this conversation that I've had, that there's this thing called social determinants of learning that is a huge factor in the success of our students. And so how do we figure out how to factor that in to, this whole application milieu and process? Because I think that's where that distance traveled really is so important, right? That idea that just because you don't have a 3.6 GPA and 5,000 hours of, experience doesn't mean that you're not resilient and have a growth mindset and capable of getting through, because you only have a 3.2, but you were still supporting your family and maybe taking care of an elderly parent or, any of those things. So
I wonder if that interpersonal, intrapersonal competence that you're working on would capture that as well.
Yeah.
It will. Yeah, it will.
Well, there's also
one thing,
Jackie, is like the support that we provide them after they get in though, too, right?
That's right.
The social determinants of learning are there, then we maybe need to invest a little more time and effort into making sure those are provided, or that they have resources or others that they can reach out to, and cultivating that in the community.
Yeah. Sorry about that little rant, but social determinants of learning, I thought was genius. And I thought it was really interesting that they discovered that was a significant part of determining whether students were going to be successful or not in a program. So
Jackie, I think I jumped over what you were going to say though.
No, I forgot to mention earlier that when I started in 2009, and another reason why I'm so invested in interviewing, when I started in 2009, we had 0% diversity. It was 0%. And after implementing the multiple many interview, we went from 0 to 27% diversity that first year that we implemented the multiple many interview, because we were casting a broader net, right? We weren't just looking at GPAs and veterinary experiences. We were looking at these other attributes, and I really think it has impacted what our student community looks like. And again, I just want to be clear, we define diversity very broadly.
Yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, socioeconomic, first gen.
Yeah. And you said, Jackie, that the vast majority of those students who are advocated for that actually do get accepted are usually quite successful, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. In fact, I clearly my favorite success story is a student. He was a white male that grew up here in Southwest Virginia, which is in Appalachia. For those of you that don't know, he could not afford to go to Virginia Tech undergrad, which is a 4-year public institution. He did community college for 2 years. It was free to him. And he applied. He had a 2.9. But when you read his life story, he was working full time on the family farm. His dad was, I think, couldn't help out. He was really ill. So he was helping the rest of the family work on his farm. We accepted him with a 2.9. He was advocated for. He graduated top in his class from vet school. And he actually is very successful. He's working for a corporation now, and doing extremely well within the profession. So that's a great success story of how sometimes these processes can work.
Yeah. Well, and giving credibility to somebody who's like, I see something in this person. Like I see that, because we've all had that experience where there's somebody who's had just the toughest of circumstances and they've been resilient. They've pushed through, not that they haven't had struggles and even failures, but they've pushed through. And you're like, I want to take a chance on this person because I don't really feel like that's the chance. And so I love that there is that opportunity to advocate for somebody. Because I've talked to some of our current students, and I had one that was in my office not that long ago. We were talking about career aspirations, and he shared that he had somebody, and it was, pre-admission, but like somebody who took a chance on, he'd had people say, you're not cut out for this. You're not gonna be able to get into vet school. And so, this is like kind of a second career for him, but he's like, I had somebody who reached out and said, you can do this, and really pushed him and supported him. And so I love that that's an option in the admissions process, because I think, again, it's 15 or so out of 1,800 is a tiny, but you're like, there's something here. And I want to stick my neck out for this person and give them a chance. And I think that's really important. So I love that that's an option. No, yeah.
I'll provide
Although no, I have a bunch of questions, so we will have to have a part 2, or I'll just chat with you offline because I'm like,
yeah. Well, I really appreciate you all so much. You all have influenced me as well, so I appreciate you all. Thanks for having me.
Well,
oh, it
thanks
was
for
great
coming
having you on the
on.
show, and pick up some of those surfing photos because I'm gonna want to see those.
I know. I want to
Yeah.
see them too.
I will not forget.
I was
Probably
very young back
through
then.
Oh shoot. Oh well, yep. Good to see everybody. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It was great having you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.